It is actually possible to drastically suppress the numbers of snakes in a forest by the dropping of baits from helicopters.
Florida's answer to an 18-foot python costs about 4 cents and is probably sitting in your bathroom cabinet right now. Not venom, not a trap, not a drone. It is the fever medicine parents give to toddlers, and a child-sized dose kills a giant snake in its sleep. Guam proved it works. Laboratories confirmed it works on Burmese pythons. Helicopters are already loaded to drop it by the thousand.
This thing fires at 4 baits per second, so we can cover 30 hectares of land in 15 minutes with a single load.
And Florida still will not pull the trigger because one animal is standing in the way, and there are fewer than 230 of them left alive. A rain of dead mice. At dawn over the Everglades, dead mice are falling out of the sky. Hundreds of them, each hanging under a small cardboard parachute, spinning down through the light and catching in the treetops. They do not drop cleanly. They snag in the branches and hang there, turning slightly, at roughly the height of a person's chest. The helicopter banks, circles back, releases hundreds more. Inside every single mouse, somebody has tucked a pill. The dispenser holds 900 cartridges in a magazine, and the aircraft carries 4 of them. 3,600 baits go out before the crew has to land and reload. 30 hectares covered in 15 minutes, then up again and again, while the light holds. The man flying it is not a vandal. He is a biologist, and his team spent days preparing these baits by hand, laying them out in rows like ordnance. This is government sanctioned, budgeted to the dollar, and calculated to the milligram. The paperwork behind a single flight runs to risk assessments and non-target modeling, because the moment poison leaves an aircraft, it stops being controllable. Everyone involved understands that. They signed off anyway. Sit with that, because it tells you something before a single fact about snakes does. These are careful people doing something that looks reckless, on purpose. So the question is not whether anyone here has lost their judgment. The question is, what is living underneath that canopy, and why every gentler option was crossed off the list first. What they are trying to kill is the Burmese python. It reaches 18 feet in length. It passes 200 pounds. Once it clears a certain size, it has no natural predator anywhere in Florida, and it eats essentially anything it can wrap. In 2016, researchers dissected a python in Florida and found a mass in its large intestine more than 30 inches long and close to 14 pounds. Under a microscope, it gave up bone fragments, teeth, hair, and 12 hooves. 3 deer, at minimum, inside a single animal. There is a photograph biologists still pass around of an 11-foot python with a white-tailed deer in its stomach that outweighed the snake carrying it. It ate something heavier than itself, then went back to lying in the water, waiting for whatever came next. But the giants are not what keeps researchers awake. It is the emptiness underneath them. In one tracking study, marsh rabbits were fitted with transmitters and released into the wild. Within 11 months, pythons were responsible for 77% of the deaths, more than every native predator in the system put together. If a story like this is worth your time, subscribe to World Enigma because it genuinely helps. Stay with it, because a solution to all of this already exists, and one single animal is the reason nobody will use it. Across large stretches of the Everglades, raccoon, opossum, and rabbit numbers have fallen by more than 90%. There are sections of marsh where survey recordings come back with no mammal sound on them at all. Not fewer animals than before, none. And the animal responsible is, for all practical purposes, invisible. The snake that cannot be found. Part of what makes the python so efficient is that it never has to specialize. A hatchling takes mice and small birds. A juvenile takes rats and nestlings. A mature animal takes raccoons. A large one takes deer. The menu scales with the body, so a python threatens a different tier of the ecosystem every year it lives. Now, try to find one. An experienced hunter working the marsh averages around 8 hours of searching before a single sighting. The pattern on the skin dissolves into sawgrass at 3 feet. The animal can lie motionless underwater for long stretches. It is not hiding in any active sense of the word. It simply does not register to the human eye as an object. Florida has spent 2 decades trying to solve this by hand anyway. Paid hunters, bounty payments by the foot, public removal contests that draw thousands of entrants and produce excellent television. All of it takes real snakes out of the system, and none of it has ever caught up, because a single female can lay up to 100 eggs in a season and a search team can only cover what it can physically walk. Eventually, the point stopped being arguable. It is not possible to hunt down an animal that cannot be located. So the researchers gave up on finding pythons and started asking a completely different question. If the snake itself cannot be reached, can its food be turned against it? That question had already been answered once, 8,000 miles away, by people who had lost nearly everything before they got around to trying it. The island that went quiet. Guam is a small island in the Western Pacific. Sometime in the late 1940s, in the shipping traffic that followed the Second World War, a brown tree snake came ashore in military cargo. One animal, or a handful of them. Nobody wrote it down because there was nothing to write down. The species is only a few feet long, mildly venomous, and no threat whatsoever to a person. Guam's birds carried one specific and fatal gap in their history. The island had never held a predator that could climb, so the birds nested low. They laid their eggs in the open. They did not flee from movement in the branches because for millions of years, nothing dangerous had moved through them. To the snake, the forest was not a habitat. It was an unlocked pantry with the lights left on. In the early 1980s, a graduate student named Julie Savage arrived to work out why the island's birds were disappearing. The early theories were pesticide contamination and then introduced disease. Neither of them held up. What she kept finding instead were abandoned nests and swallowed eggs. She is described standing in forests that should have carried the sound of dozens of species and hearing nothing at all, then looking down and finding a brown tree snake at her feet. Her findings were published in 1987, and a large part of the scientific community refused to believe them because the claims seemed wildly out of proportion to the animal making it. One unremarkable snake could not possibly empty an entire island. It already had. 10 of Guam's 12 native forest bird species were gone completely, and the survivors were finished in every way that mattered. 40 years, and the forests went silent. Here is the detail worth holding on to because it comes back and changes everything about the decision Florida is facing. By the time Guam was desperate enough to drop poison into its own forests from the air, there was almost nothing left in those forests to lose. The birds were already gone. The system was already hollow. The Everglades is not hollow. That is the whole problem with copying the solution. A method is never just a technique. It carries the conditions it was invented under. On Guam, the calculation ran in only one direction, because whatever the poison killed by accident was already functionally extinct. Move the same helicopters and the same baits to a wetland that still holds almost everything it started with, and an identical procedure produces a completely different moral ledger. The tool did not change. The ledger did. But before any of that mattered, the people on Guam had to find something that would actually kill a snake. What they found was so ordinary that it took a while for anyone to believe it. The pill in the medicine cabinet. The compound that worked was acetaminophen, paracetamol. The active ingredient in Tylenol, sitting right now in most household bathroom cabinets in the developed world. The reason lies in the liver. A snake lacks the enzyme pathway that mammals use to break the compound down. Instead of being processed and cleared, it converts the blood into a form that can no longer carry oxygen. The snake does not thrash, and it does not convulse. It slows down, stops moving, and stops breathing. As deaths deliberately caused by humans go, it is unusually quiet. The part that made researchers sit up was the dose. Around 80 milligrams will kill an adult brown tree snake. That is a child's fever dose. To kill a mammal of comparable body weight would take something in the order of 500 times more. Think about what that means. This is a poison that chooses its victim by physiology rather than by aim, which almost nothing in the history of pest control has ever managed. It is not flawless. Once a snake passes roughly 200 grams, the effect begins to fall away. So American researchers moved to around 160 milligrams to hold the larger end of the range. Does the same weakness exist in the Burmese python? In laboratory testing, yes. The same missing enzyme pathway, the same result. That is a laboratory finding rather than a field-proven one. And the distinction matters. But on the evidence available, acetaminophen kills a Burmese python much the way it kills a snake on Guam. So every component was on the table at once. a compound that costs almost nothing, a weakness the target cannot simply evolve its way out of in a hurry, a delivery method already proven from a helicopter over dense canopy, and a state that wanted this species gone badly enough to pay for all of it. On paper, that should have been the end of the pythons. The Everglades is not blanketed in mice, and the first reason has nothing to do with ethics or politics. It has to do with the size of the animal everyone is trying to kill. The flaw is the size. A mature Burmese python will not eat a mouse. At 16 feet and 165 pounds, a mouse is not food. It is not even worth the energy of the strike. That animal is hunting raccoons and hogs and deer. You could drop every medicated bait the budget allows, and the largest pythons in the system would slide straight past all of them without registering that anything had happened, which seems to mean the perfect weapon is useless against exactly the animals that frighten people most. Except that pythons are not born at that size. A hatchling is roughly the length and weight of an adult brown tree snake, and at that size, every part of the picture changes. Hatchling pythons eat mice, and they eat small birds. And critically, unlike the heavy adults that spend most of their lives underwater, young pythons climb. They move along low branches and through the lower canopy, which is exactly the layer where a mouse on a cardboard parachute ends up hanging. The biologist Kristen Hart has tracked dozens of juvenile pythons in the Everglades using transmitters. Her reading of the movement data is that the young animals behave like explorers. They travel constantly, they investigate, they test anything that might fit in the mouth. Bait in a tree is not something a juvenile python stumbles across by luck. It is something a juvenile python is already looking for. And here is where the numbers turn cruel in a useful direction. Nobody has to kill the adults at all. Remove the juveniles consistently across a wide enough area for enough consecutive seasons and recruitment stops. The existing adults simply age out. Nothing arrives to replace them. Modeling suggests the whole population folds inside roughly a decade. The only obstacle is scale. Covering the Everglades does not take thousands of baits. It takes millions, dropped repeatedly, several times a year, for years. And the moment millions of poison baits go into a wetland still full of living things, a different problem arrives, and nobody has produced a good answer to it. Nothing on Earth controls which animal picks the bait up. The one animal that cannot afford it. Guam could absorb that risk because Guam had already lost the collateral. The Everglades still holds roughly 350 bird species, 60 reptiles, 40 mammals, and 50 fish. This is not an empty island. It is not extermination. It is surgery on something still breathing. Australia already ran this experiment without intending to. Poison baiting aimed at foxes and feral cats also killed wedge-tailed eagles that scavenged the poison carcasses, and goannas that came to them afterwards. The compound would not stay inside the target species. It traveled up through the food chain because that is what food chains are for. In the Everglades, the chain is more tangled, not less. Picture it running. A raccoon eats a medicated mouse and dies out in the brush. An owl finds the body and carries pieces of it back to a nest. Nestlings are the weakest link in the system, and a dose an adult bird shrugs off can end a whole brood. A loss like that leaves no evidence at the time. It shows up months later, as nests that should be full and are silent. The case for going ahead anyway deserves stating plainly. Baits are formulated and placed to favor the target, and doses are calibrated below mammalian thresholds. The damage from doing nothing is not hypothetical. It is a 90% collapse already on the record. Every month of caution carries its own body count. Then there is the animal that stops the conversation dead. Credible estimates put the surviving adult Florida panther population between 120 and 230. Take the lower figure. A cat that once ranged across the American Southeast is now confined to one corner of Southwest Florida, boxed in by highways, by housing, and by the Everglades itself, which is precisely where the bait would fall. Daryl Land spent more than 30 years tracking these panthers, to the point of knowing individual animals by their collar frequencies. What that record shows is a population with no margin at all. There is no surplus here to absorb losses, and very few substances on Earth are as toxic to a cat as acetaminophen. A cat's liver lacks the same enzyme pathway that makes the compound lethal to snakes. Small doses destroy red blood cells and push the liver towards failure, And the amount that leaves a 30-pound raccoon mildly unwell can kill a 130-pound panther. Panthers hunt deer and hogs, but they are opportunists like everything else out there. They investigate unfamiliar scent, and they move along water margins and brush edges, the same strips where bait would land most thickly. Picture a Florida panther, one of the last 120 on Earth, nosing through the undergrowth at dusk. It spots a mouse hanging from a low branch. 3 seconds. It swallows the thing whole and walks off already dying without any sign that anything has happened. This is why every serious risk assessment ends at the same sentence. The bait cannot be deployed in or near panther range. In South Florida, panther range and python range overlap almost exactly. The cure and the disease are standing on the same ground, and the panther is not even the cruelest part of this. There is a second animal in the way, and it turns the whole plan into something close to a tragedy. The snake that was already doing the job. Most people have never heard of the eastern indigo snake, and right now it may be the most important animal in this war. It is the longest native snake in North America, reaching 8 or 9 feet, and it is not a subtle animal. In direct sun, the scales throw off a deep blue-black iridescence, close to gunmetal, which is where the name comes from. It is not venomous and does not need to be. It hunts by overpowering force, and it is famously indifferent to the venom of the snakes it preys on, including rattlesnakes, which it takes head first and swallows while they are still fighting. It is also one of the very few creatures in Florida that actively hunts young pythons. It does not ambush them. It runs them down and swallows them whole. Sit with that for a moment. Nature had already supplied Florida with a native, self-replicating answer to the python problem. No helicopters, no permits, no dosing calculations. An animal quietly doing the job for free, for as long as both species had shared the peninsula. And humans had already broken it. Habitat loss reduced the eastern indigo snake so severely that captive breeding programs now exist purely to keep it in the landscape at all. There are people whose entire working lives are spent hatching these animals and releasing them back into pine forest, one at a time, hoping enough survive to hold on. Now, the part that is hard to sit with. Eastern indigo snakes eat mice. If medicated bait blankets the Everglades, they will take it, and take it eagerly, because a dead mouse hanging at snake height is exactly what this animal is built to find. Whether their bodies can survive acetaminophen has never been tested. Not tested and found risky. Never tested at all. Nobody knows. Which produces the sharpest version of this story. In the effort to kill the python, Florida could poison the one native animal already killing pythons for nothing. And the imprecision runs further than a single species, because bait dropped from a helicopter is never placed. It is only distributed. What Australia already learned. The Burmese python is semi-aquatic, which means coverage has to be heavy across wet ground, lake edges, and marsh margins. A predictable share of every load will land in the water. Fish will take it. Native water snakes and cottonmouths will take it. From there, the compound enters the aquatic food web along routes nobody can follow afterwards. There is no way to audit where it went, or what it removed. Supporters point out, fairly, that acetaminophen breaks down rather than accumulating in tissue. That is true, and it still does not tell anyone how many indigo snakes would be acceptable. So, the real question stops being about pythons at all, it becomes a question about us. Has any intervention on this scale ever produced only the outcome it was designed for? The record is not encouraging, and the clearest example comes from the country that has been running the experiment longest. For decades, Australia used a compound called 1080, sodium fluoroacetate, against foxes and feral cats. Australia is an unusually good place to use it, because a number of native plants produce that same compound naturally, so native animals evolved a tolerance the introduced species never had. The selectivity was built into the continent itself. The early results were what conservationists had hoped for. Quokka numbers recovered. Koalas on Kangaroo Island were protected from the cats and foxes hunting them. For a while, it read as a clean success story. Then biology did what biology always does. By the early 2000s, some rabbit populations were showing measurable tolerance to 1080. The target was adapting, and a tool described as a permanent solution was quietly turning into a temporary one. That is the most expensive lesson available anywhere in this story, and it costs nothing to learn from. Large-scale biological intervention does not produce only the intended effect. Unintended consequences are not a failure of execution. They are a property of the method. And even where the science holds up, there is one more barrier that has nothing to do with biology at all. In the early 2020s, Florida approved the release of genetically modified mosquitoes to suppress a disease-carrying species. One Brazilian campaign had cut mosquito numbers by around 95%. The evidence was strong. The public was not interested in the evidence. Residents called them Frankenstein mosquitoes. Lawsuits were filed. Town hall meetings turned into shouting matches that ran until people walked out. And that was a biting insect nobody on Earth has ever defended. Now, imagine standing at that microphone with this announcement. Millions of medicated dead mice dropped from helicopters over a preserve containing panthers, eagles, protected snakes, and the occasional house cat belonging to somebody living at the edge of it. That meeting does not end quietly, and no agency wants to be the one holding the microphone when it starts. So, while the decision sits unmade, Florida fights this with whatever it already has in hand. While Florida decides, the hunting continues every day. Licensed hunters, paid contractors, organized removal competitions. Thousands of snakes come out every year, and every one of them is real. It still does not match the breeding rate. There are detection dogs now, trained to scent pythons in cover a full search team would walk straight past. In trials, they perform extremely well, but scaling that across the entire Everglades would take infrastructure and funding nobody has allocated. The most effective tactic running is pure cunning. Researchers fit male pythons with transmitters and release them. When breeding season arrives, the male does the searching, finds the females, and the team follows the signal to the whole cluster. Other lines are open too. Pheromone traps built from female scent, pathogens tailored to the species, genetic intervention modeled on the mosquito work. Every one of them is unfinished. They are called Judas snakes. And they work because they exploit the one behavior the species cannot suppress. A python can avoid heat, avoid movement, and avoid detection for months at a time, but it cannot avoid breeding and remain a python. The tactic takes out large reproductive females, the only category of removal that meaningfully bends the population curve. It is also entirely manual, which caps how much marsh it will ever cover, which is exactly why the mousedrop refuses to go away. Set against a row of slow, expensive, half-built measures, it is the only option that is simple, brutal, and available immediately. Load the helicopter, take off, and watch a population fail from the sky. That simplicity is what makes it so hard to argue against. And there is a detail that tends to get skipped entirely. Burmese pythons did not swim to Florida under their own power. They were imported and sold as pets, then released when they outgrew the people who bought them. This entire crisis is the product of human impatience. Now, to correct that mistake, another shortcut is on the table, and this one is capable of killing the species it was meant to protect. That is the real question underneath all of this. When a war cannot be won quickly, what does responsible action look like? The slow, costly approach nobody ever applauds? Or one decisive bet on an ecosystem with no way to undo it afterwards? Nobody in the room has a confident answer, including the people best qualified to give one. And out in the marsh, none of the argument registers. Somewhere under the sawgrass, a female python is coiled around a clutch of eggs, holding them at exactly the right temperature, waiting. She is not afraid of the helicopter. She is not afraid of the compound. She has no reason to be, because while the decision is still being debated, the pythons are not waiting for it. They are moving north, out of the Everglades, into country that has never held them. And that is a different story entirely. Thanks for watching to the end. If this was worth your time, hit like and subscribe to World Enigma. It genuinely helps. And tell me in the comments where you land on it. Drop the bait and accept the losses, or hold the line and let the pythons keep spreading. See you in the next one.